A warm welcome from my end, and this is the 10th actually meetup today, and I'm quite glad actually. Just before the big summer break over here in Europe, we managed actually to put another one together, and I'm deeply excited, thrilled to say the least, because today we not only have actually two outstanding actually presenters on the soft side or the soft aspects of managing teams and actually making meta management work, and I leave it to the two presenters actually to explain why they've dressed in the same color. Um, beside beside that, I would like to also welcome all of you actually back again from wherever you actually dial in from the far north, Sweden, over to, from my perspective, actually to the far west in the US and Germany as well. And so therefore, welcome to all of you. As usual, I've asked the presenters actually to just actually introduce to their topic for around about 20 minutes, and then it's open floor for discussions and so forth. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Nadine. Would you mind actually just briefly introducing yourself? Something you can do much I could ever do it, and then over to you.
Yeah, hello from Berlin. It's very sunny here, really hot. So I'm actually boiling a little bit. And today I will talk about the invisible factors of successful project management. I'm a lawyer, quite evidently. I'm a founder and a coach. So who am I and why do I talk about legal project management? I'm the co-founder of LEGALEAP, and LEGALEAP is a startup providing training and coaching on conscious client communication, and actually an interdisciplinary startup because my co-founder is a psychologist. And through my startup, the work on my startup, and also through my own practical experience in prior in-house positions, I discovered that providing better advice on legal projects is one of the main areas of unexploited potential I currently see in the legal market. And today I want to talk about the invisible factors in project management. And I wonder, when I say that word, do you have a picture, a feeling, or an idea in mind what those invisible factors are? So is there something that comes up in you when you hear this? And I'm actually super excited to hear more from you. And yeah, maybe someone is courageous enough to share some thoughts on that before I shape the discussion by telling you more about my ideas and perceptions. So yeah, first question to the audience, what comes up in you when you hear that word, invisible factors of project management?
I think of Kanban boards and crazy Excel spreadsheets.
Kanban boards and crazy Excel sheets.
I think of communication.
And communication, all in big letters.
Yeah.
Like emotional intelligence, something that comes to mind.
And the ability to work within teams.
Ability to work in teams.
Cultural patterns that I don't see and don't know of.
Patterns that I don't see and don't know of.
I think of social styles and personality styles and how that impacts all of the things that have been mentioned already.
Social styles and personality styles. Yeah. Very interesting. I hope that I will hear more from you on that later on, and maybe also some like concrete examples that you see in your practical work that brought you to thinking that these are important invisible factors, and I would love to see how they show up in the in practice. So now let's dive deeper into those mysterious invisible factors, and what I see is actually pretty close and clicks well with a lot of things that you said. So what I mean by invisible factors is actually human factors. And as you might know, human beings are slightly more complex and difficult to handle than numbers or tasks on a to-do list. So legal projects usually involve various stakeholders, internal and external. This also means that the human factor gets even more relevant than as if you just do like a normal legal work as a lawyer. So what are those invisible factors concrete, and how can you use your awareness of those factors for successful project management? And I would like to speak about two factors today. That is clarity and empathy. For me, clarity is to remove internal barriers, and empathy is to speak the language of your target group and be aware of their feelings. So how does that look in practice? Because it's pretty abstract. So I'm giving you some examples. My first example is on clarity. I started my career in big law at Allen & Overy. And there I discovered the first invisible factor, clarity, in my first legal project ever, when I was working as an entry-level associate. I was asked by my boss to manage a team who prepared documents for a due diligence. However, I was supposed to manage the team. However, I continued to turn back to my boss and ask his opinion on various matters. I just didn't want to do anything that would be going too far because I didn't want my boss to feel passed over. And I had been seeing him being sensitive about that in other contexts. So I was a little bit aware of this. I didn't want to do that. So at one point, I think it was after my third or fourth question to him, he told me, he was actually quite annoyed at that point, just take all decisions on your own. And it was such a relief for me because finally I had a clear go, a green light, a permission to decide, and I could just go and solve the problem. And at the end, this was one of the most stressful yet most satisfying days of my life. And here, the invisible factor that made all the difference for me was my boss who told me, just do it. And in a very clear way, okay, just do it, you can decide. My second example on clarity was as a general counsel when I was responsible for a restructuring project and setting up a new entity. And one of my colleagues was supposed to become the new MD of this entity. However, I felt that he was kind of reluctant and slow in all interactions concerning the setup of the new entity. I finally pointed out what I mostly felt because he hadn't said anything about that. So I said, to me, it feels as if you're not really interested in this new position. And this opened him up, and suddenly it turned out he was actually planning to leave the company soon. So what I learned out of that is that we really shouldn't be afraid to ask the difficult questions because sometimes it's the only way to get clarity. So maybe you experienced a similar scenario where clarity was a key for successful project management, where a role needed to be clearly defined, or where an actual commitment to a role needed to be checked out and proven. My second factor that I would like to talk about is empathy. So often the success of a project depends upon understanding the hidden interest of the stakeholders we work with. So another experience I had as a general counsel in a hypergrowth startup was I had a project carving out the customer service unit from the parent company. And under German law, employees have the possibility to reject to such a transfer to another business unit. If they do so, they would continuously stay with the mother company, which was a result that for business reasons should be avoided in this project. So the aim was avoid that any employee rejects to the transfer. That meant we needed to foresee the fears and the possible course of thinking of the employees. How could we do that? If you want to better assess how an employee might react or feel, you can do that by creating an employee avatar. And you probably know these client avatars, and maybe you've also already done that for projects. It actually means you create kind of a picture of a typical employee and you think about, okay, what kind of worries does this person have? What kind of background does this person have? And this concept helps you to think about what will be relevant for your target group. So in our case, it was the employees that were supposed to be transferred from the mother company to another entity. So for instance, our target group had worries around the following topics. Will my salary change? No, it won't. Will I lose my job? No, you won't. Can I still come to the mother company's Christmas party? Yes, you can. Will I still get breakfast in the morning for free? Yes, just in another room. Will my place of work change? Yes, you will move to a brand new office space just in the building next door. To answer all of those questions, we added Q's and A's to the official document, which was actually a lengthy document, like 10 pages in very detailed German legal language, which actually no normal person can understand. So we added some Q's and A's, made it really simple. We used a very simple language and we addressed all those employees' fears in a way that they could actually understand. So simple and easy is always better in that case. And finally, we also, in addition to that general information, offered one-on-one sessions with employees who had specific concerns to go through all their questions. And discovering their specific fears and what was really behind was very critical in that project to avoid anybody to reject to the transfer. For instance, we had one employee where it turned out she wanted to buy a piece of land for a garden, and it was super important for her. It was really like a big aim, and her train of thought was if she would reject to the transfer, she would receive a lump sum so she could use that to buy the garden. And in this case, we found an individual solution. The employee had some shares from the company and got her stock options paid out in advance. Conclusion. Invisible factors are human factors, and finding a good way to deal with feelings and emotions of stakeholders is crucial for smooth project management. And we shouldn't be afraid to ask the hard questions. An uncomfortable truth is in the long run better than not knowing what is going on. To avoid or overcome obstacles, empathize with your stakeholders and consciously consider their position in the solutions you carve out. Be very clear about roles and the commitment to roles to avoid misunderstandings. So these are some of my examples with invisible factors. And yeah, I would love to hear more about your experiences with invisible factors and also how you came to your conclusion of choosing the factors you just mentioned before, like Kanban boards, communication, emotional intelligence, and so on, patterns that come up. So how did you come to the conclusion of your invisible factors?
Thanks so much, Nadine. Any comments? Or any questions, rather?
I think the one experience you told us about the partner of Big Law, I will say, from Ellen Overy, who said, make your own decisions, is one experience which most of Big Law lawyers experience at the beginning of their professional life. And I think it's one of the key factors to be a successful lawyer. But on the other hand, it is sometimes a bit difficult to deal with this characteristic, because in a big firm, in a big company, it is not wished in all of them to have own decisions. They want to include as most or as possible people into the decision process.
Yeah, exactly. I also think that this is kind of the or a specific problem in that case, because you don't really know what do they actually want. You kind of hear one message and you feel another message, and I'm pretty perceptive to like feeling messages that I receive. So I kind of start internally, okay, I want to do it in the way the person really wants it. And if I feel if it doesn't really fit together, I could potentially end up a little bit undecisive if I'm not like bringing in some clarity on my own and actually ask for clarity. And turning that around, I think giving this clarity to the stakeholders in your project, and if they are responsible for a task, to make it really clear that the same message is given through all the channels, like not giving them another feeling, but really empowering them on all the different levels, is super essential for people to actually really move on.
So if I may share, one of the explanations for emails having 1,500 people actually copied in that I received was actually because I wasn't sure whether somebody else did not want to contribute as well, which also indicates there's no, I mean, RACI diagram, forget it. That has never been actually probably considered, but it's a reflection of the, don't know, somebody else may also have an interest in this. But if you experience something like that, I mean, is there any hope? Because that's what we get to see in our daily lives.
What do you think? Is there any hope?
Occasionally.
I think so. I was in a meeting of professional project managers 1 or 2 months ago, and they discussed about the holacracy model of work. And I don't know, holacracy, is that the right English word for holacracy? It's a model which is very, very democratic and based oriented, and which denies any hierarchy within an organization and within processes. And so I think that could be a hope.
But then hope obviously is part of the governance. So you get rid of this democratic one man, one woman, one word, and start actually introducing steep hierarchies, right?
Yeah. Well, I had a reaction to what you described with your situation, and because I said the invisible factor that I focus on is social and personality styles, and you talked about how you perceive emotions and the request for clarity. So I'm at the other end of the spectrum. I'm task oriented. I like people. I love people, but and when I have difficulty with people, I turn it into a task rather than a feeling. But the point I'm going to make here is that you did 2 things in the description that resonated with me. The first one was you looked at who the stakeholders were, and you had a very broad definition of who the stakeholders were. And I like that. Anybody who's affected by or who has an interest in a project is the definition of a stakeholder. Whether the stakeholder has to be on a RACI chart or a LACI chart is an entirely separate question. And then the second aspect of it is when you talked about the need for clarity, which to me is a social statement, a perception feeling statement, I immediately went to assumptions, which sounds more like math, but it's the way I look at the world from a task point of view. we could have a conversation and end up in exactly the same place. But I think that I go into a situation saying, who are the stakeholders and whether they're assumptions? And I acknowledge that their assumptions are made up of both personal, professional, group, and other factors, all of which can lead one into the quest for clarity about what to do, what people want or need or feel, as well as the tasks that need to be performed. So that's my reaction to the situation you described.
Very interesting, Eileen. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's a super important point to highlight, that actually there's the spectrum, and what I perceived, of course, somebody else might perceive it differently. It's just in my head. It's the story that I create, and somebody else might create a completely different story. It's just more this being aware that people might create a story. Maybe not, but it can always happen.
Marian, I saw your hand.
Yeah, it's actually the first time I'm happy about the Zoom hand, because I'm having some kind of tennis elbow without playing tennis. It's probably a garden elbow. I want to stress, yes, there is hope when it comes to clarity. What I try to do in my work when I advise on legal project management is to find the sweet spots and let people try to find their own why for the clarity. So for more senior lawyers and partners and project leads, it's part of the scoping process. The more clarity you can get out of your client, and you have to get it by asking, the better your fee estimate will be and the more profitable you will be. When it comes to younger lawyers, especially the very youngest, I tell them it's, you were born with the inborn right to clarity. You need clarity to do your best to do a good job. So please just go and ask questions till you have a satisfactory answer. And if you are working with these very busy people who don't have time for clarity, sometimes it helps to just tell them, look, if you give me 5 minutes and some explanations now, I can help you more, I can help you better later. Or sometimes you just throw yourself in their path and don't let them leave the room until you have received that kind of clarity. Clarity is not something that's given. Clarity is something that needs to be taken.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, clarity needs to be taken. So everyone who is able to take that clarity, I mean, this is giving me more power. And at the same time, when I'm the one leading a team, I can make it easy, for my team or for my stakeholders to actually be the person to give that clarity to them.
Now, clarity is the one aspect you mentioned. The other one is empathy. Now, let me frame this carefully. So empathy is not necessarily something you would immediately expect as a trait of any legal professional. At least not if you run actually a sort of popular survey. That would not be the first attribute being mentioned by the interviewees. I mean, it would more be around technical excellence, logical thinking. Empathy would not necessarily feature. So what's your experience actually in your day-to-day business? How do you plant a seed and find friends to sort of grow the lobby for empathy amongst lawyers?
Well, I recently heard from a very big law firm who are actually already having a tool for structured client feedback, which I find very interesting. I don't think it's the case for many law firms, but there is one who told me that who has it. And there were two factors that came up where clients of law firms said that they had other expectations or that they were not super happy. So one was the, how do I say that in English? The remuneration system. So the way the legal fees are paid. So they were not happy with that. And the other point was they wanted a better communication with their lawyers in between different mandates. And the second one for me is actually an empathy thing, because to be able to do that properly in a way that the other person likes it, I need to understand that person. I need to jump in, to be able to step in their shoes and understand, okay, what is their need? How much communication do they want? Through which channel do they want it? What kind of communication do they want? Do they want me to just pick up the phone and have a chat about whatever, or do they want me to send them an article from time to time? Do they want to be invited for lunch? Do they want to receive interesting legal information, and on what subject? So to be able to find out in a sensitive way what it is, what they need, I think empathy is one of these key skills.
So your comment about empathy is very well taken, and I've actually heard it characterized as business empathy as compared to personal empathy. When I hear the word empathy, it's how do you feel about somebody else's experience at a personal level. And I've heard it expressed as business empathy, as you just described, saying, what is useful for you? How do you feel about our business relationship and how we can communicate better? So I found that distinction to be a useful way to reinforce the point in this context. And then that gets back into, the other issue, which is you're dealing with human beings who have personal needs. So the whole issue of how often do you want me to communicate with you? Are you juggling a family? Is it easier for us to communicate after the kids go to sleep? Versus how many communications do you want to get? So you're dealing with both the business issue of content and format, but you're also dealing with the personal issue of how can we respect each other as whole people with lives that are more than our work lives, and how can we create alternate ways of interacting with each other?
It's interesting to come in on that. I've not heard that distinction of personal empathy, business empathy. I just wonder, it is interesting. And, it's a topic that I talk a lot about and we'll come on to. Is this a really good example of how the lawyers in particular manage to disassociate feelings and personal feelings by calling it business empathy? Because if we called it empathy, gosh, that would make us uncomfortable. So we'll call it business empathy, and that will allow us then to somehow have these conversations without appearing to be vulnerable or weak, showing emotion. And I wonder whether or not
I agree with you, Dan, but the person who framed it that way was not a lawyer.
Okay, well, there you go. It's not just lawyers. It's good to know. It was
somebody who was not a lawyer. And in fact, it was, among other things, a person who's very active in DIE initiatives.
Okay.
Which struck me as a perfect merger of personal and professional, business and human dimensions. But I agree with you completely. Just as I said, I'm a task person. I'd be the first one to talk about business empathy rather than personal empathy. On the other hand, I recognize it sufficiently to say, I know this is an area that I need to hone.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. I'm just thinking about if I'm looking at it from my own team's perspective and how I work with them in a very personal capacity. And I genuinely want to understand what's happening in their life, because that informs how they will perform at work. And I'd almost get to the stage where we'd be, let's have a conversation about your personal life, and now let's have a conversation separately about your work life. Whereas actually I treat them both very much the same, because one plays into the other. But provided it's doing the job of bringing people closer together, maybe the tag actually is almost a side issue, because what it's doing is opening up the conversation, whatever label you give to it.
That's right. And you're also in what you just described, and I think which underlies this whole discussion, is about our need for meaning and purpose. And that, I grew up in a generation where who cared about your purpose? You just go to work, you make money, you rise the ladder, and then you look back and say, what was the point of all of that? And so I really welcome, these different ways of approaching these issues to get to the core issue of we are human and we work is part of our life. It's not our life.
Yeah.
Now, in this context, since we sort of almost touched upon it, actually, then does empathy have a role in the O-shaped lawyer sort of scheme in the way you set it up and the way you include it? And it would be great, before you actually delve into the details and all the exciting things you've been doing with this initiative, could you just share a couple of highlights from your professional career with us to better understand where you're coming from? What sort of drove you to the point that where you said no more, let's do something, let's put it actually up on the board and let's discuss? And
absolutely, with pleasure.
That would be fantastic. Yeah.
So professional background wise, I trained at what was a UK law firm, but merged quite quickly with a US law firm. Merged is perhaps the wrong word. I think probably consumed was more the word. And this is with Deckert. And I spent 7 years at Deckert before I moved in-house and am now a general counsel for a division within Network Rail. So Network Rail is the operator, maintainer, renewer, enhancer of the rail network in the UK. And my team of about 20 lawyers or so, they support the business and the colleagues with all of their kind of legal needs across the different regions they operate in. So I've been doing that role for about 5 years. Before that, I stepped out of the legal team and I did what I describe as a senior program manager role. I think it was a program manager role. I think over the last years, I've promoted myself and called it a senior program manager role. But effectively, it was a project management role. And that was possibly the start of my journey into looking at the legal profession more generally. Because the reason I did that central project for a year or so was because the person who was leading it, the director, was someone I'd come to know quite well through a leadership development program I'd been on. He knew me quite well. And I said to him that I'd love to be able to participate in this central program. It's high profile. It looks really interesting. And he said to me, I'd love you to be involved, Dan, but we don't need a lawyer at the moment. And I said, well, how about I don't do it as a lawyer? How about I do it as a human being? And he said, wow, okay, gosh, I never thought for 1 minute that you'd want to step away from your day job to do this. And I said, absolutely, because so much of what we do, we're constrained by, I think, our job titles. And in many respects, I think that lawyers and any other role that puts legal in front of it, in truth, whether that's legal project management, legal technology, legal operations, actually that, I think, perhaps boxes us off into a label that perhaps doesn't demonstrate all of the different skills and talents that people in these roles can have and can offer. And for me, that this idea of the perception of the lawyer as being very narrow in the focus was really a precursor, I think, to the program, which really formally kicked off about 2 years ago. But before that was also informed by a conversation with my group general counsel, so my boss, when we were recruiting into the team. And we were looking for people who, yes, of course, were capable technical lawyers, but people who we felt would be able to present themselves to the business in a very credible human way. Because most of our business weren't overly concerned with the law. They were concerned with solving problems and wanted lawyers in the business or whoever else in the business to help them do that. And when we met people and interviewed people, particularly from big law firms, but generally from private practice law firms, what we found were very much technical experts, people who were academically very smart. These were good people, but they were people who I would have felt very uncomfortable putting in front of senior management in the business because they couldn't talk any other language apart from law. And the realization for me at that point that we had done something in our profession that had caused this, because these were people who had huge latent talents hidden within, lots of skills that were just not sufficiently recognized or rewarded. And it was that became, I think, the turning point for me to say, you know what, yes, we'll find someone. We'll find what eventually I think we've called the O-shaped lawyer. We'll find that lawyer. But we shouldn't have to go through 20, 30 of them in order to get there. And so that's really the precursor, Ignaz, to the program. It was really what set it all alight. And as and when you guys are ready, I'm very happy to share a bit more about what we've done, where it's come from in a bit more detail, and what we're hoping to do next, as and when you're ready.
I guess we are following what you just actually spoken about. We can all relate to what you said. I mean, 110%, literally, and we've seen it actually in similar roles as part of actually non-fee earning stuff. From an advisory perspective, those actually sitting in the middle between the two parties actually and trying to bring them together in terms of procurement processes and so forth. So I believe there's, and please raise your hand if you disagree with me, but there's not one single person in the room who has not seen that actually before.
Yeah, and you know, the important thing to stress at this point, the lawyering element of it has been, you know, part of the early thinking. As we're developing that thinking, I talk much more about the O-shaped professional now. It's not really a term I'm overly happy about, but it needs to capture, particularly to Nadine's point around just this type of conversation, the invisible factors. There are invisible factors for project managers, for lawyers, for legal operations, anything associated almost with any profession in truth, but it's so obvious within the legal profession that there is still a major differentiator between the fee earners and still called the non-fee earners. And part of what we're doing is trying to bring to life the fact that if you choose to work with a law firm or within your own in-house team, it's not just the lawyers that create the value for the business or the client, it's the combination of the different skill sets that exist. And until we've leveled that playing field a bit more. So for example, when I meet every so often with the law firm partners who are client relationship partners, anything that goes beyond the normal day-to-day operational side of the relationship, the legal stuff, it's almost pointless to start raising with them. You know, what about we can try and find some kind of solution to this? Or, you know, we don't even know what the problem statement is, but we want to talk this through with you. Frankly, it's pointless having those conversations with 3 senior partners at law firms because they simply don't have the skill set to contribute to that conversation. Now, that's not a criticism of them, but what it's saying is you do have a skill set which we need, but so does your technology expert, so does your head of innovation, so does your chief information officer. We should be bringing these people together as part of the conversation. So I've jumped ahead a lot, but I wanted to make that point. And you'll see that there's 3 slides I have. I promised you, Ignaz, I would keep it very short in slides. And there are very few, and it's pictorial more than anything. But I do want to share them because I think they're important.
Yes. You should be able to share your screen.
I'll try. It's not essential, but if I can, I will. But to follow on from that conversation around recruitment, I spoke to a number of peers, a number of other general counsel, and said, do you have the same kind of issue I'm facing? And many of them said, and since this over the last 2 years, I've not heard one general counsel say anything different, which is when we recruit from private practice, it takes a minimum of 12 months to 18 months to be able to have the lawyers unlearn what they've been doing in their time in private practice and learn how to be a genuine business partner and support to our business. And frankly, I found that just staggering. It's true in my own experience, but I find it staggering given that ultimately we are on the same side trying to deliver a service to an end user. And for us to be so misaligned has again been another real trigger for the work that we've done. We met a group of, I think we interviewed 18 leading general counsel in the UK, some multinational companies, but the general counsels in the UK. And we really asked them, what does good look like when it comes to working with lawyers? And perhaps what good doesn't look like, what bad looks like doesn't sound quite right, but what does good look like? And really the report that we produced back in February last year was quite simple. It said legal knowledge is your entry level. Those lawyers we want to recruit and those lawyers we want to work with at the law firms are able to understand us as a business, understand us as people, understand our sector. And again, that's quite normal. There's nothing unusual about that. I think the next stage is perhaps the area that is becoming much more normal. They said the lawyers we really want to work with are those who can create value for our business. And I think that whilst we talk a lot about value creation in-house, in private practice, the same in any kind of support function anywhere, that question of are we adding value is a real challenge. And I'll come to it shortly. But when we talk about creating value, I have seen a whole range of different views as to what that actually means when it comes from either private practice or in-house. But what we did, and this is where I'll just share a slide with you, just so you can see the output of that, the outcome of that work. So let's just see if you can see my screen. This is the introductory slide, which in truth I don't need to share very much now, but you can see it. Which was, these are the kind of things that when we talk to other GCs, these are the kind of things that we heard around kind of classic lawyer traits. Now, I'm sure you'll tell me, but I imagine it's very similar for a lot of those in the support functions within law firms, because it's certainly the same within the support functions within our legal team. We've already touched on a few of these in Nadine in your session, particularly this idea of emotion. But lots of this, I think, is what leads to some of the problems we see in the profession today. But when we put some of this to the General Counsel, this was kind of the output of the conversation. Broadly, that knowledge is kind of yesteryear. The lawyers of the future will be about value. Let me just show you this first, actually. Sorry, I forgot about this one, but this is good. So this is a study done in Princeton University by two professors at Princeton University in the States. And they mapped the trust in professionals. They mapped competency against warmth, and they put in there where are the different professions against competence and warmth. And for warmth, you can read trust. And this goes to the point, I was going to bring it up before, but this goes to the point we're talking about lawyers being very much in the high in technical ability, but much lower when it comes to that warmth, that competence, that trust element, that compassion. And obviously top right corner is where people would like to be, that kind of nurse teacher where you're both competent and also warm. And obviously you can see that lawyers are just above prostitute when it comes into the bottom left corner there when it comes to warmth. Now that's a study in the States, but what this said to me was really validating some of the research that we'd done to say that, look, we know lawyers are very competent and technically very gifted, but we also know emotionally they're quite backward. I read something a while ago. I think it was the $1 Trillion Coach. It was a book that I don't know whether anyone's read, but the main character in that, talking about his life in Silicon Valley, and how he looked for people who had smarts and hearts. So I quite like the phrase smarts and hearts. It's not mine. I've stolen it with aplomb, but it's, for me, this is what this is getting at. It's people who are technically smart, but also have the compassion. So anyway, that was one thing I think goes to the conversation we've just had. But where the GCs came to was this. Now, there's a lot on here, so I'm not going to go through this, but this was the distillation of all the conversations. And we put the information into 3 buckets of attributes: build relationships, create value, be adaptable. And so empathy, you can see, is right up there in building relationships. So each of those different attributes, and I'm happy just to share this, or if people feel that would be valuable to them. But this was, I think, the modern day thinking of General Counsel. At first, certainly in the UK, we were talking about, but now I've been talking much more globally to GCs. And I think the model has really chimed with them. Not that there's anything new in terms of the words. I'm not all of a sudden creating a new environment and world of words. What I'm saying is that this is really alien to the legal profession. This isn't something that people would necessarily associate with high quality lawyers, certainly in the past. But when I talked to the GCs, when we got this information, we tried to understand, why is it that these aren't skills that lawyers are particularly good at? Why is it that these are things that are almost kind of an add-on? They see it as a soft skills, is the way that many would refer to them as. They're almost a kind of extra. Being a great lawyer is about doing the law. And yeah, do you know what? If you can do all these other things, great. But actually, that's not what gets you promoted. That's not what gets you rewarded in the legal world. What gets you rewarded is the billing, is the hours, and the money that you bring in. So I'm going to stop sharing now because we don't want to divert too much on that. But where we came to early on in the process was that legal education is flawed, and the legal education drives, and this was in the UK at first, but I've looked globally now, and I'll talk a bit more about that. It's focused very much on academia. It's focused very much on technical, and it doesn't prepare people for practice, is the long and short of it. Now, in the UK, there's a burning platform because the course that has been the entrance course for lawyers for 30 years is being phased out and is being replaced with a new program, which I had thought when I started off the O-Shape that would be the answer to all of the problems of legal education. Actually, it begs more questions than it does provide more answers. It still regards skills as being advocacy skills, negotiation skills, research skills. They are skills as far as this new product is concerned. So what it has allowed us to do is bring to the law schools here and more widely a conversation around the attributes of the well-rounded or O-shaped lawyer, that these are attributes that customers value. And the biggest surprise of all, perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised, was when the regulatory authority here in the UK went out to consult on a new legal education program. They didn't consult with in-house lawyers. They consulted with the law firms. The law schools, of course, have law firms here as their clients because it's law firms in the UK that pay for most of the lawyers to go through law school. I know it's different in different jurisdictions. And so there was one in-house lawyer that has been mentioned in all the different consultations I've seen. And now they, of course, have the report from the O-Shape, which has come from lots of leading in-house lawyers saying these are the skills we value. Given the legal knowledge, of course, we expect them to get the law right, but these are the skills we value. So the work we've been doing is essentially then split into two. It's split into legal education, where we're looking to have an influence on bringing these skills into legal education and starting the next generation of lawyers and legal professionals, because we know the future holds much more than simply down the traditional law path, that they have these skills, these employability skills that they can come into practice on. And then when we talk to, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Global League of Law Schools. So the Global League of Law Schools that I've come to know a bit more about recently is a collective of some of the most progressive law schools in the world that come together to say we want to try and do something different when it comes to legal education. And they recently produced a blueprint report that said we've got real gaps in in legal skills, particularly internationally across law schools. It's a really detailed report, but it does go through a whole host of different jurisdictions across every continent in the globe. But what it highlighted was that technology is a problem. We all know that technology is something that the legal profession is trying to grapple with. But what was really interesting for me was how high this lack of skills development was. So we know that this is a global issue. We're also talking to the International Bar Association because the influence they could have in bringing about a change to the way education is developed could be huge. But we certainly need more support around that. And it's a very political organization, and therefore you almost have to be able to offer something in order to make sure they'll support your initiative. So there's an education piece, but we know if we get legal education right, that all we'll do is open the eyes up more to all of these talents coming in to think, wow, the legal profession really values these skills. And we know then they'll come into practice on day one, and there'll be a trainee in Allen & Overy, Nadine. I'm not suggesting Allen & Overy is different to any other Magic Circle firm and big law firm, But all of a sudden, these skills that they have seen as being those they value, those they strive for, those they believe they're coming into the profession to make a real difference, are no longer relevant. Actually, all that's relevant is that they get the work, they do the work, and that means it's 24/7 at times. It means that they have to hit targets, and ultimately everything else becomes secondary. So we've been very clear that we want to come at this from bottom up, from the law schools upwards, and top down, from law firm partners, from general counsel. And certainly the general counsel community is incredibly important in this, and we engage with them a lot, because the general counsel community have the ability to change the way in which law is practiced. They are the customers of the services provided, and yet they haven't to date made enough of an inroad into how law is delivered. Largely that's because I think in-house teams have only become so sophisticated over the last 10, 15 years as they've grown. Within that time, many of the big in-house teams I talk to are still looking at how to get their own teams in the right place with skills like this, with customer focus, with alignment to corporate strategy. They're still doing a lot of that they haven't looked at their supply chain yet and said, do we want our supply chains to reflect the values that we have as an organization? Well, clearly the answer is yes, but no change has really come as of yet. We see a lot talk about D&I, and we know that law firms take that very seriously, but in truth, the needle has moved so little over the course of the last decade or two that one would start to think cynically that perhaps law firms are in a place where they want their D&I statistics to be right, because that will help them achieve more success on panels. I'll leave that for discussion. But what we've started to do with the O-shape is ask GCs to bring it to life as part of their tender materials. Now, we know that risks lip service, as we say in the UK. I'm sorry if that doesn't translate easily. That means that people will ultimately just say yes and will tick a box in order to get on your panel. Now, the GCs are quite aware of this, that this is a real possibility. So what we're trying to do with it, and what we've done, is bring it to life in a slightly different way. We've started up pilot programs, well, they've now finished, between in-house and private practice to create that alignment, to continue with their day-to-day work, but do it in a way that applies the O-shape attributes. So it means they're not meeting every quarter to go through their supplier-buyer relationship, which the buyer doesn't enjoy, the supplier doesn't enjoy, and everyone breathes a sigh of relief when that quarterly meeting is over and we don't have to do that again for 3 months. What this is saying is actually, if you really want to be our partners, if you really want, as we hear so commonly in our profession about our external providers are an extension of our in-house teams, that's a great way of making a headline. It doesn't exist in most cases in reality. So we bring these groups together, and it's not just the lawyers. We've had people in corporate governance involved, we've had operations involved, and they then work together through their existing workload, but they do it by reflecting on 1 hour every 2 weeks for 6 months, how they are doing the work, the how, not the what. So they're saying, are we giving enough feedback in the right way? Are we communicating effectively? It's a two-way process. So it's not just about attacking the law firms for not delivering. It's about saying, let's remove all blame. Let's create a psychologically safe environment where people can share genuinely what their concerns are. And what we've seen through the course of those is that the relationships, not surprisingly, when you put a group of people who have progressive mindsets that have just never been allowed to flourish, put them in one place and give them 12 hours together to talk about these things, not surprisingly, they get to know each other quite well. They get to like each other. They get to share experiences. They get to work on things, and they get to be creative. And all of a sudden, this idea is that lawyers and law firms can't be innovative goes out the window, because of course they can be. It's just not valued in the same way as the legal technical skills. And what we're pushing really hard for, and saying that the law firms who will stand out, the legal teams who will stand out, and ultimately the lawyers who will stand out, are those who are able to combine the technical. We're not in any way dispensing with the need to be good technical lawyers, but those that can combine that with a much more rounded approach to building relationships, to being able to understand the empathy point, understand what that person you're working with wants and needs, help them by solving their problems with them. That will create value, and continuously be agile and flexible to shift your needs and wants to make sure that you're meeting those of your customer. And in truth, this is about giving the lawyers the skills to provide a better service to the customer. This isn't just a nice learning and development idea that we work with L&D and say, here's a training course for an hour on communication skills, and think that somehow we're turning those lawyers into the most wonderful communicators, or those legal project managers into the most wonderful communicators. We know that that type of learning is not sustainable long term. What we're saying is this has to be a cultural shift where it becomes part of everyone's everyday activity, that we think and work in a very different way. I've got, and have quite openly said, I think the way in which we teach lawyers throughout their development, leaving aside the flaws with education, but continuous development of lawyers is completely flawed, because what happens is you get law firm partners who need the hours done by their teams, can't let their lawyers and associates go off and do training for a day, not too often anyway, and they'll say to the L&D team, the learning and development team, just go and send off this individual, this associate, for 2 hours on business development, and because they're really struggling with that, and then give me someone back that somehow is going to be a brilliant business developer. It's just so out of reality that we need a different approach. And so that's why we're looking at this as a whole for the profession, not just law schools, not just law firms, not just in-house teams. Now, that's a huge undertaking, and I, for 1 minute, don't suggest that this is going to be an overnight thing. And it does need a collaborative approach across the different parts. So we're not throwing rocks at law firms saying, you're too expensive, you don't care. No, we're trying to do it in a collaborative way, which is, I know that ultimately law firms are about making profit, but there are lots of good people in law firms who want to do the right thing too. And if we can find the right people who will ultimately understand that it's good for business to work this way. And that's the real struggle with people, getting people to understand that this is good for business. If you have a workforce that's engaged, if you have empowerment and trust in your people, that they will build relationships with their peers at junior and mid-levels in-house, they are going to be your next GCs. They are going to be your next partners, and you can have a long-lasting, sustainable relationship. So it's a huge undertaking. I've probably spoken for far too long, Ignaz, and it'd be great to open it up for conversation.
I can't speak on behalf of the others, but I wish you have had the opportunities in the past talking to all my previous law firms on a weekly basis, repetitively, with the same vigor, the same openness, and the same the same eloquency. And but last but not least, probably this authenticity, this sort of, it's coming straight from the heart, and it's not just the usual some sort of like law firm bashing that we get to see, and it's also not the usual, okay, I'll just put something on the table, but it's you know, it's completely unrelated and out of context. So, and that's really the fantastic aspect about the initiative, combining actually a serious concern that everybody shares but nobody's able to articulate, first of all, with actually the means and actually an idea forward, and not just actually getting stuck in this sort of complaints mode. So therefore, personally, you hear me actually hear loud applause from my end, and I trust it's the same is true for all the other attendees.
Dan, there's a multiplier effect. There may only be 5 other of us on this call, but between our ability to amplify it through our networks and the opportunity to disseminate this, I concur with Ignaz. Next week, I'm going to be facilitating a retreat of the senior leadership team of a US legal department, where they won an award 6 years ago for being, the best legal department of the year. and where it's not a multinational, it is a multinational company. They actually have somebody based in London who I'm going to be meeting, but they are not known as the big conglomerate with the big household name. And one of the things that we are focusing on in this retreat is how do they continue to maintain their edge as well-integrated business advisors who in many ways are already O-shaped lawyers. But just because they were recognized for that 5 years ago and that's what they have achieved doesn't mean it's self-maintaining. So part of what I'm going to be presenting to them is a section on the lawyer of the future. I was planning to start with the Delta model because I really want them to parse it at a very granular level. And I believe that what you're doing, and this is sort of the conversation that we can have offline or that I'm raising here, which is competence in the law is assumed, which is one level of the Delta model. Knowledge of the business and business operations is another piece of the Delta model. And the third piece is personal characteristics. What I'm seeing you do with the O-shaped attributes is to really amplify the personal attributes and not just say they're attributes or skills that can be acquired, but give concrete examples through adaptability, relationship building, and adding value about what the outcome is as a result of having all of that. So I may actually start with the O-shaped lawyer next week versus lead into it. I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet, but I really appreciate the way you presented it and articulated it. The second aspect is in this company, they have a very significant commitment to wellness. Mm-hmm. And the wellness commitment focuses on financial, social, personal, and emotional in the way they articulate it. Among the senior leadership in the company, the champion is the general counsel. So I'm thinking I may be making a match among some people to chat about this some more, because I see this, U.S. legal department that I'm describing as a complete outlier. Most people just want to learn how you can get integrated with the business and focus on how do we solve business problems rather than address legal issues. So, I think that, there are not a lot of them, but there are kindred spirits. And for my point, I will do everything I can to help facilitate this conversation.
Thank you, Eileen. That's brilliant. I didn't realize. I just saw your note that Carrie, who's part of it as well. So that's brilliant, Eileen. So I'm very happy to have a separate chat as well about that.
Yeah,
what we can do.
Yeah. I met Carrie when she was involved with the Fullbridge program.
Okay, yeah. Okay, makes sense. So the Delta model is another great example, and I've spoken to Kat Moon on a number of occasions, and I'm a big fan. And as you say, we've really honed in because there are lots of, if you look at that kind of process, practice, and people, the three they're looking at. I mean, it's a huge undertaking in the first place, just looking at people. But the practice for me is well covered largely. The process, when it's legal operations, technology, project management, there is lots happening in that space, and there has been for some time. And there are some fabulous people doing some fabulous work in that space. For me, the gap has continuously, that's come up again and again, that no one is really driving into, has been the people side. And yes, it's part of me. And, I've always adopted a people first, then lawyers mantra as my team. And, when I hear my team talk like that, and I hear others talk like that, it's fabulous because that's who we are. The fact that we are expert in an area doesn't make us. It shouldn't define us. What should define us is actually we're good people to work with and work for. We care about each other. So ultimately, we should be happier and healthier doing what we do. That isn't soft and fluffy to me. That is a question of being able to enjoy what you do and be good at it. And so it's great to hear there are kindred spirits. I think there are quite a few, certainly in the GC community in the UK I work with, who are in that place. And for us to be able to be the voice of them is a real honor and a privilege.
You made another comment that resonated, which is when you were reacting to the comment about how legal education captured information from law firms and not from general counsel. And you used a term that I've used for many, many years, so I'm delighted to hear someone else use it, which is supply chain. It goes back to the idea that the knowledge and experience and business problem and business opportunity maximization that lawyers are involved in is part of a knowledge supply chain. That you go, I'm providing legal advice, and I'm either going to have it done inside, outside, or do it myself. Well, this all goes back to the fact that what lawyers produce are solutions to business problems and opportunities and people problems and opportunities. And so instead of conceptualizing it as the delivery of legal services and how do we educate people, it's how do we create a completely frictionless supply chain so business can do business within the framework of the regulatory and legal context we exist in globally, rather than so lawyers can do their craft. So that's another way in which using that term supply chain anchors it in the business world rather than in the quill pen that we all learned how to use our first day in law school.
I agree with that.
Yeah, there's plenty of touch points, I suppose, and Nadine can confirm that. I mean, there was recently a roundtable hosted by Harold and Nadine on exactly those topics actually, and there's clearly actually a mindset actually appreciating the fact that it can't go on like that actually forever. So, and I mentioned actually the launch of the law faculty this week, and it will be different. It will be evolution rather than a revolution. So we're not actually sort of storming the barricades and tear down everything. So there's good bits and pieces there actually in terms of technical excellence, but it needs to be massively extended and supplemented by other areas, anything from technology, management, the people component, people leadership, and so forth. And that's one. The other thing is when I mentioned that you would actually join us tonight, I just recently joined actually a continental European think tank for legal innovation, and they apparently they had a look at the O-shaped lawyer initiative already, and I would say they're about to actually get in touch with you. And also they run a number of projects, anything from technology, people aspects to process management at the moment, how to better describe certain processes in in-house operation and so forth. And that's, it's spreading. So you basically, I think the way you approached this, you basically started just looking at the first brick in the wall and you pulled it out. So the wall is actually, it may actually fall apart eventually, but while you're actually building a new actually house. And I mean, Aileen, we've done the same with the International Institute of Legal Project Management. We are currently we got a working group on looking at the competency model for legal project managers, because it's not just a technical discipline, it's more than that. It's about people leadership, it's about communication skills and so forth. I mean, much more than what you would actually get under normal circumstances. But that actually having said, I got one more question before we sort of actually leave you or let you go, although we could listen to you forever, admittedly. In your in-house environment, and I'm not sure whether that's actually true across the board, but many in-house departments are actually made up of former private practitioners, because that's still the largest source of recruitment. And and importing or bringing somebody on board, you automatically import the good and the not so great habits and rituals and so forth. I mean, how are you dealing in your model with that? Because you can't, I mean, at Clifford Chance, for instance, we basically took the young graduates from university and said we're going to dismantle them and rebuild them in order to make them work. But we did it more in a technical way because we felt they were not appropriately trained on the technical side of things. But how you do that, how would you actually tackle that in terms of the O-shaped lawyer model?
My preference largely is to try and recruit now from people who have already had in-house experience.
Okay.
Because it's not always the case and it can't always be possible. Everyone who is in my team has had experience at law firms. Some have come direct from law firms, others have come from in-house. But because there is a difference of approach, I don't think there should be such a difference of approach. And I don't think in the long term there will, because otherwise we're not going to be able to survive in this, certainly in the same. We've effectively created two professions. And I made a suggestion that a round table to one of the senior partners at a law firm, and there was a group of people saying, you know, just this, I think we've created two round tables. Said, actually, maybe we should start having specific legal education for in-house lawyers and legal courses for in-house lawyers, because we're going off in such different directions. Now, I said it tongue-in-cheek, in truth. I didn't really mean it. But the more I think about it, I'm starting to believe in my own hype. But what was interesting is that the senior partner at the firm said, absolutely not. Any lawyer worth their salt has to do some time, their first few years in private practice, to get a grounding. Now, I wholeheartedly disagree, of course. But you know, I think that we provide junior lawyers with a fabulous training and development, and in a real life kind of way. But what probably coming back to just to wrap that up in as to your question is, yes, of course, I'd like to go for people with in-house experience first, because I think they've gone through that mindset shift already. People do need to go through a mindset shift coming in-house, because all of a sudden you've gone from fee earner to support staff. And some people just can't get their head around the idea that I was the one that used to say to IT and press a button and IT would be at my desk and there'd be change in my computer. Now, all of a sudden, I am the IT, but I just so happen to be a lawyer, but I am the equivalent of the IT to the people who run the business where they are. And they can't get their head around the fact that they're moving from, I've done all this work to be so kind of important in my job, and now I'm being treated like a business support person. It's outrageous. And people can't make that shift. Mentally, they just don't last with it, because they're so used to everyone running around them to help fix everything quickly for them so they could go off and do the fee earning. Well, that's what we do now. We are with HR. We are with the operations team. We are with marketing. We are with every other support function, working together, running around to try and help the business do what it needs to do. And that's a hard shift for some people. And some people just will not get there.
Okay.
So there are 2 points you just made that are really fantastic. One of which is the comment about the partner in the law firm who said, well, of course they have to spend, you know, year one to get a grounding. Well, a grounding in being a law firm lawyer, not necessarily in being a lawyer who serves clients in a business. A grounding in being a lawyer's lawyer, but not necessarily in being what we call a counselor.
Yeah.
That's point number one. Point number two is I want to commend to your point about locking everybody in a room for a few hours and talking about things. On Netflix now, you can watch Oslo. And Oslo, for those who may not be aware of it, is about the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks in the 90s. And the idea that instead of sitting around a traditional diplomatic table, this should be done at a human level, that there should be parallel negotiations going on. And the movie is really well done. And the idea that people should connect as people versus as roles or statuses is the revolutionary idea conveyed in the movie. And the way in which the Israelis and the Palestinians are able to reach an accord that unfortunately never came to pass, and here we are dealing with it again. But the human level is done so well. And I would actually recommend segments of that movie be used in training programs it's about a real person, not about a persona or a status that you're dealing with.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's fabulous. I haven't seen it, but I will do.
Yeah, no, well worth the time.
So with that, actually, sequel recommendation, which will actually take us to the next level in terms of e-learning or TV, learning by TV. My children usually last time explained that they learn more from YouTube now than from their school books, which is actually a nice excuse, but there may be a little bit of a tiny piece of actually truth in it. And so on that note, a big thank you to the two of you. And obviously we will share the video. We will cut it a little bit at the beginning and end, but we're not friends of censorship of any kind. So it will be raw in the best possible sense. And we put it up on YouTube, and then others will actually have the benefit of actually listening to the two of you, because those are important topics. Those are essential topics actually also for the further development of the profession. These days we tend to get lured into the trap of actually always talking about technology, but technology will never work without actually making the human side work. And therefore, again, a big thank you to the two of you for your time, your views, your thoughts, your observations, and all that's left is wishing you a great summer holiday break, because that's what we're going to do with the big LPM idea. And then we will actually come back in most likely in August with a couple of people actually in new topics, new faces, and keep safe, get vaccinated. Hopefully you got access to any vaccines. That's the bigger challenge these days. And yeah, and see you soon. Thank you for today.